views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to journalists and writers and editors and photographers and filmmakers. And this is the category we're going to put everybody who's on the show tonight in. Anybody who puts something out in the Bronx. We give them the opportunity to talk about what they've put out and give you a little bit, if not a lot of bit, of insight as to what it's all about. This evening, two very important segments. One is going to be about our environment and what's going on in the Bronx as regards justice in environmental issues. And the second part, this is something I'm really looking forward to. We're going to hear from a doctor who served at Montefiore Medical Center in the emergency room through the pandemic, and he's just written a book. We're going to talk about that book. Right now, let me welcome Dr. Lessie Branch, who's the director of the Think Tank at the Thinkubator, and nice to have you with us again, Dr. Branch.
Thank you, Gary. Nice to be with you.
Let's talk about the report you put out. This was a policy brief about environmental racism in New York City, something that unfortunately Bronxites know a lot about. So let's talk about why you did it, and then in general, what the conclusions were.
So why we did it? Well, we wanted to, look at two things. What is the effect of the Bronx environment on youth? And two, what shapes environmental literacy among Bronx residents? And so the Thinkubator, as you are aware, is a youth focused organization. We bring power to youth voices. And so a lot of what we do is driven by the youth. And they were interested in creating this survey and, having residents of the Bronx answer this. And so this is why we did it again, to get a sense of what people's literacy is around environmental racism, and also to look at what is the effect of environmental racism on Bronx youth.
I think that what you did is really interesting and important, because many of us adults, and certainly people like myself, let's say, who are involved in issues, and we talk about issues all the time, we kind of understand it. And maybe when I saw the report, I was like, well, yeah, I know all about it. But your point of view to say, wait a minute, there are young people who hear about it like out there in the clouds, but this is their future, and maybe they can have some input, not to mention that our entire new electorate is going to be young people. What did you find? What was the sense that you got from young people with this policy brief?
Well, absolutely. Overwhelmingly, the Bronx youth are not ignorant of the issues that are in their community. They are very well aware and they are very engaged. And to your point, this is, their future, and they are next up in terms of making the age of enfranchisement where they will have the opportunity to exercise the right to vote. And so in some ways, this is their way, if you will, of holding the elected's feet to the fire. Look, we know what some of the issues are. These issues have a direct impact on us, particularly our health, and we want to know what you're going to do about it. And to help you along, we've even come up with some policy recommendations that we'd like for you to consider.
Yep, we'll review those. There's a photograph at the lead of this report, which really it tells the whole story. It's so disgusting that I can't believe it's anywhere, let alone in my beautiful home borough of the Bronx. We say, okay, there's environmental racism. Where do you see it? Where's the evidence of it that needs to be looked at in this, with this periscope?
So overwhelmingly, I would suggest that where it needs to be looked at are in the health outcomes. Um, the Bronx, as you are aware, is number 62 out of 62 counties in New York State. And, there are direct correlations that tie to environmental racism and some of the health outcomes that are experienced by citizens and young citizens at that of the Bronx. Highest asthma rates, if not second highest. We have this nice little chart in there that talks about, if you will, some of the health outcomes that correlate with, if you will.
And what makes you think that these are the result of the environment as opposed to maybe another somewhat related but not directly related aspect like access to healthy food or some other factors? What makes you think that it's the environment?
Well, so when we talk about socioeconomic determinants of health, it's all of those things, right? I would argue, and so it's not
Air
uh,
pollution, water
right.
pollution, cleanliness of parks, on and on.
Exactly. And so it's all of those things. And then, coupled with that, it's the access, it's the education, it's where you live. I mean, in the Bronx a couple of years ago, when we had the issue with Legionnaire's disease, it wasn't because people were behaving in ways that caused them to get this. It was an environmental issue, whereas the water towers, as I understand it, in some of the
That's true.
buildings hadn't been cleaned. And the result was a health outcome that resulted in Bronx residents contracting Legionnaire's disease.
I thought what was interesting about the policy brief that the Thinkubator put out used the word racism. Now, we've had many studies that will say environmental justice.
Mhm.
Racism is a much more pointed term. And so, what makes you think that it's a racist thing as opposed to simply an injustice? In other words, that people's ethnicities, they just happen to be on the receiving end. But racism would suggest that there is somebody or some people or some a body that says, you know what, they get and they do not.
So that's a great point. And I would suggest to you that it's racist in that when you look at how race correlates to the issue, there is a strong positive correlation. As you know, the Bronx is predominantly made up of Latinx and or Hispanic folks, followed by Black folks of the African diaspora.
I got the numbers which I pulled out of your report. 56% Latino, 29% Blacks or African Americans, and less than 10% whites. Those are the facts.
Right. And so there's a correlation. And so it's not to suggest that somebody is intentionally being racist. Sometimes racism is not, I can't remember what the term is, but there are,
Systemic. You want to use
right,
that term? Systemic.
systemic, right? And so, but to that point, when we look at how things break down by race, we can't deny the fact that, you know, government once upon a time created these systems that allowed racism to exist. And in some ways, because it is systemic, even though there aren't necessarily racist in government who are perpetuating these things, the systems continue and live on and perpetuate. And so clearly there is a need to, change the systems.
Uh, One thing that came out, and we're going to run out of time, but I definitely want to get to the 4 points that you guys, analyzed and put out, is that you found that most residents who you talked to for this survey believe that pollution has not impacted their lives. That's fascinating. That says to me that Bronxites are like, we're just going to keep going, even though the health numbers, the health indicators, the cleanliness of neighborhoods, as I say, cleanliness of parks, we all know it does. On the other hand, 71% said they support environmentally friendly policies. They're ready to recycle. They want cleaner alternatives for the air. They want to address litter and pollution and more sustainable infrastructure. Bronxites are ready to do this. That's the way I read what I read in your report.
That's true. And they are, and one of the things I love about Bronxites is their grit. And so, with regard to the whole phenomena of climate change, Darren Walker, the president of Ford Foundation's analogy of eating lobster on the Titanic, to me is apropos, right? So if we fail to recognize and acknowledge the origins or even the underpinnings, if you will, of environmental racism or climate injustice, or however you want to name it, we all go under. We all go down. All go under the sea, and not
Nobody's exempt.
right.
That's right.
And so, if we think more broadly, what if and when Earth becomes inhabitable, right? Where we gonna live?
We watch what's going on in the West. We saw that the smog was blowing literally up 3,000 miles across the country. You got to know what's happening. Before we run out of time, I'm going to list the 4 recommendations and then ask you to sum up of how we're going to get there. Promote youth-based input for environmental justice, which you talked about right at the top. Support Bronx policy agendas that increase capacity for green jobs. Again, you talk to Bronxites, they're going to click yes. They're going to vote yes every time. Advocate for green energy development, especially in low-income housing, and restructure the Bronx infrastructure and amend planning. How do we do those? You got about a minute. How do we do those things, or at least start the process that we can address these things that your report articulates?
So I think part of how we started is with the infrastructure bill, right? There are lots of good things in that infrastructure bill at the federal level. I think states could really adopt it, and even local organizations can too. Solar panels on public housing, incentivize people to, buy hybrid and or
Electric vehicles. Sure.
There are lots of ways that we can do it. No shortage.
I'm one last thing before we go, which I've been a proponent of, is that recycling. I realize if you look at the numbers, recycling doesn't really affect, the carbon footprint that much, but it engages everybody that it's their responsibility when they separate their food or their garbage. I mean, to me, that's the kind of thing we need to do so that we all realize we all have a role in this. I mean, that's my agenda. The last thing I'm going to say from my perspective, I'm done with the plastic. I'm done with the plastic bags. The fact that we could put a man on the moon, we can create a vaccine in a matter of months, and we can't figure out how to make biodegradable plastic bags is beyond me. Time to get that done. That's Gary's advocacy. That's Gary's report.
Well, yeah, definitely.
I know you're with me. Listen, Dr. Lessie Branch, who was part of the team that put together the Environmental Racism in New York City Policy Brief. Thank you. Thank my friend Eddie Summers, Dr. Summers at the Thinkubator. Keep doing the great work. Keep putting it out, and we'll keep talking about it. How about that?
Thanks so much.
Great. Dr. Lessie Branch from the Thinkubator. All right, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, a doctor from Montefiore Medical Center who wrote a book about what it was like in the emergency room at Montefiore during the pandemic. Don't go away.